Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Imperium Art. I'm so pleased to have with us today a gentleman who interviewed me on his show not long ago, and the link will be in the below in the show notes. A very, very intelligent and politically active young man goes by the name of N of One. How are you today, sir?
I am doing quite well, and of course, I am delighted to be on your program this
Hmm.
evening.
Thank you so much for joining us. And once again, my good friend and co-host Nullus. How are you today, Nullus?
I'm doing well, thank you very much, and welcome N of One, and hello to the audience.
Beautiful. So, N of One, you have a YouTube channel, and as people go through the channel, they can see numerous kinds of videos about many kinds of topics. I saw that you met Tulsi Gabbard at one point. At another point, you interviewed John Mark from the Proprietarian Movement. That you've been involved in a lot of fascinating stuff, and so if you could kind of give us a nice intro, let us know, how you became who you are and what you do.
So, what I am is a lover of liberty,
Mm.
fun, and learning new things.
Mm.
And over the past few years, I realized that the globalists are seriously cramping my style in that regard. And I decided to darn well do something about it.
Mm.
And people have always told me I have a knack for speaking and explaining very abstract and even sometimes very abstruse concepts
Mm.
very clearly and cogently.
Yes.
And so I decided to give the web creator shtick a crack.
Nice.
And I have a very modest little channel of my own in vidcast format. It's just a man and a webcam.
Yeah.
And I get up and in front of my camera and do these unscripted pontifications on matters of political philosophy, economics, and some fun lifestyle items as well.
I really enjoy that. And I'm really shocked to hear that they're unscripted. That is almost hard to believe because the way you expound on all these subtle details, and you just take your time to open it up and get into all these machinations of whatever it is, that if you're critiquing somebody in our political sphere, or you're breaking down political points, you're doing commentary on movements that have come and gone, or talking about the future and what we should be doing. It's all quite well done, and I'm kind of shocked to hear that none of it's scripted. I think most people would at least need to write this stuff out and maybe have some kind of notes. So I feel like you have a talent for this.
I only very occasionally use notes for the longest form videos, such as my video on Randian nationalism. And that, I would say, is the work I'm proudest of. That would be my most original, I think, insightful, and most important.
What is Randian nationalism?
Oh, it's just essentially identifying the fact that your national identity and your racial one are parts of your overall individual identity.
Mm-hmm.
So, by the ethics of Rand's philosophy, objectivism,
Mm-hmm.
nationalism in that regard is imperative.
Okay. So what's your overall take on Ayn Rand and her philosophy, her contributions?
Ayn Rand is the greatest woman who ever lived.
Okay. And that closes that. I see how you feel.
Well, perhaps it does, but I'm actually very glad you asked, because I believe the next segment you have in mind is to ask me how I became red-pilled, as they say.
Correct.
And it was actually Ayn Rand who was my portal into the deep right, as I like to call it. That's the term Mencius Moldbug coined.
Okay.
And I just got on YouTube and started watching videos on politics, looking for discussion of Ayn Rand, and one of her apologists appeared on the Rubin Report. And for me, having peered down that rabbit hole, the rest was history.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe your political philosophy then?
The term I use for my overall political worldview is ultra-reactionary.
Mm.
It's very similar to that of the neo-reactionaries, whose thought Mencius Moldbug, aka Curtis Yarvin, his real name, was the seminal developer. I do like to distinguish myself from them sociologically more than philosophically, however, because unlike them, for one, I don't pretend not to be a libertarian, which I am, but of course, libertarianism is a highly delimited philosophy and is only a part of my overall political worldview. And the other sociological problem that's manifest in the reactosphere, as it's called, is cucking on the JQ effectively. And this is probably due to undue acceptance or hero worship of Curtis Yarvin himself and his biases and lacunae on that particular matter.
Mm-hmm. So as far as your activism and things that you're doing, what can you share with us?
My activism takes many forms, and most of it, I would say, is actually off camera. I'm a part of a number of different nationalist groups, and the group we met through is but one, yes, but that is probably my most significant affiliation. I would say my collaboration with that group is very important to me. That would be the Occidental Patricians Alliance, for those who don't know. And I would, of course, appreciate it if you link to that as well, because our main Discord server is open to all interested. But I've been associated with other groups who are more street-oriented. The former is more of a secret society modeled on the Freemasons, hoping to emulate the success they've enjoyed. But I've gotten out and held signs. I've gotten out on street corners just by myself, holding signs, say, like Search Dancing Israelis. I participated in marches. I've written emails to local representatives calling for them to reject refugee resettlement.
Good.
I do it all. I'm very passionate about this.
What advice would you give to people who are looking for or are already involved in nationalist activist groups?
To know yourself, and if you feel as though you don't, take time, perhaps even away from the everyday world, to reflect on who you really are and what your own values are and how you weight different aspects of your identity, because that will shape your approach to pursuing your interest with respect to those values and identities. And that varies from person to person. There is no right answer. For some, as I've discussed in a recent video of mine, nationalist activism is a religious pursuit. It is a form of connecting with the transcendent. And some people are naturally just more religious, more metaphorically minded than others. I am not that at all. I am very much a pragmatist and a literal-minded person. I'm not religious at all. So my activism is effectively just looking out for number one, the N of one. But I've done a great deal of soul searching over many years, and I am very clear with myself what I want in life, what my values, what my identity is overall, and what I should do about them. I think that's some process that everyone ought to go through if they care about living a good life.
So the term religious, I think, is literal and symbolic here, and I think you're using it more symbolically. I guess in a sense, maybe spiritual in some sense. These things are all core to identity and like, as you say, soul searching. And I think everybody who's familiar with this movement is very much aware of the notion of become who you are. And this segues actually very smoothly into the arts. So it's actually an excellent springboard right into discussing the Imperium Art essay. So but I just kind of want to frame this a little bit more. And I really like letting the audience get to know you more because you're such a unique character, a unique voice, and you're very brilliant and well read. So what we try to do with our guests is to see what they can bring to the conversation. So it's an ongoing documentary of the Imperium Art Project, and everybody has their own angle. So I think in the end, when the whole project is looked at, from a bird's eye view, it'll be profoundly rich, and enriching. So this topic of knowing yourself is really core. And I think the beginning of the essay is a quote by T.S. Eliot that says, what I do wish to affirm is that the whole of modern literature is corrupted by what I call secularism, that it is simply unaware of, simply cannot understand the meaning of the primacy of the supernatural over the natural life, of something which I assume to be our primary concern. And that was, hats off to Nullus to, use that quote. So, I think the terms spirituality, religion are a little clunky, but that's all we kind of have, because it is really, I suppose, a spiritual inward journey to look at. If I don't know who I am, who my history is, who my people are, if I don't understand my biospirit, how can I make decisions, and how can I know what direction to go in? So let's first of all, I want to just pass the mic real quick to Nullus and let him just kind of chime in a bit, respond to anything you've said.
Well, there's really nothing to respond to. I think that I fundamentally agree with everything that was said. I think that ideology is downstream from identity. I think you have to understand who you are first. You have to understand not just yourself, not just yourself, but also your family, your responsibilities, your immediate community. In the ancient world, you had the, the gens, the extended family. You had the ethnos. You had all of these different understandings and contextualizations of identity, and they all evolved over time, ultimately forming various forms of social cohesion that became nation states, that became empires, even in some cases. So you have various forms of identities that evolve, and I personally believe that it's all connected with the metaphysical. It's all connected with your faith, with understanding that there is something greater than yourself. Now, that's the religiosity that the N of One is really talking about, that something is greater than yourself. Now, I personally equate that with the divine, with God, but I understand that there are quite a few people out there who don't. But the religiosity of it, I think, is maybe a form of evangelizing this message to everyone. It's a responsibility that we carry. It's a responsibility our ancestors gave to us, and it's also a responsibility that we owe our descendants. So I think that all of this ties together very nicely. So I'm really in full agreement. Outside, of course, the difference of opinion on religion, but that's, again, everyone is not going to be the same on that one.
Sure. So on the topic of the arts, before we begin on your commentary on the Imperium Art essay, could you give us just an overview of your thoughts on the arts and the arts in our movement?
Well, my mother is an artist and illustrator, so I grew up in a house full of her works, and they were quite varied, because what she felt to be her vocation as an artist was mixed media collages, which are not, I would say, the most marketable genre, and some of hers were positively bizarre. And the more commercially viable of her work was these imitation scrimshaw drawings she would do on various natural artifacts, such as scallop shells, pieces of wood, or even, fungi, actually. that was indigenous to my home state of Maine. And that was something that she always wrestled with, how much time to allocate between the more, what you could say, spiritually fulfilling work versus the more commercially viable.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible to have fun, but there's a difference between fun and happiness and perhaps joy or spiritual fulfillment. And that dilemma was something that I noticed was a persistent concern for her in her life. And that was the perspective on perhaps art, or at least the life of the lot of an artist. Now, I myself have relatively little artistic inclination. I did have some aptitude for sketching likenesses as a youth, but I never had the passion for it. So that's not something I ever went out and developed. I take much more strongly after my father, who's a software engineer, and my academic background is economics and finance.
Okay.
But it's said that, I think from Nietzsche, that only beauty can save the world. And ultimately, even our very ethics could be considered a subset of aesthetics. And so if we cannot express, sometimes in, non-verbal fashion, although of course writing is also a type of art, but in all genres, in all media, that which speaks to the most fundamental aspects of our identity, then that is obviously a very impoverished existence. And I myself am not a pure collectivist survivalist variant of nationalist either. I believe in quality of life as well as quantity over whatever time scale. And in that regard, I think art, whether one has the personal aptitude or not, is essential in ways that many of us perhaps don't even realize. And I would say, especially perhaps gamers, video games are the perhaps newest medium in the arts. And there is considerable variance in in terms of how a game is oriented toward perhaps what we could say the spiritual, divine, or pure aesthetic versus pure entertainment. And I remember you discussing this in the movie genre on an earlier podcast of yours. You were talking about Michael Bay movies or Adam Sandler movies versus something like Lawrence of Arabia or film noir or something like that. It's all within one genre, but there's huge variance in terms of the purpose, the intention, and the style within that genre. So those are just a few of my thoughts to get us started here.
What do you think Friedrich Nietzsche meant when he said beauty can save the world?
Nietzsche is often completely inscrutable. I read all his major works, and most of it I still am not close to understanding in any meaningful way. But I suppose just egotistically, I'd like to think that he agrees with me that a life without aesthetic aspiration is one not worth living. Because obviously art speaks to something that cannot be rationalistically excogitated. It speaks to something deep within our souls, at least in its highest forms. It's a non-cognitive, non-rational level of our conscious or even subconscious being that art speaks to. And that ties very heavily into romanticism, that some of the most important phenomena in life are not something that can be objectively or rationally determined with our forebrain. we have to satisfy the primitive within us as well. There's even wisdom in the primitive, in the primal, the Dionysian, as Nietzsche might have described it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that the overall philosophy of Romanticism tries to emphasize, and it's one that I myself am in large part sympathetic to.
Mm-hmm. Why so?
I would say because, as I mentioned earlier, that ethics is a subset of aesthetics. I don't think there is any objective rational basis of morality, because morality is behavior that pertains to our very existence. And you can only exist with a certain type of identity. But of course, identity is hugely variable, and thus morality varies by identity and is by definition subjective. So insofar as a romantic worldview dovetails with a subjectivist one on that level, I am very sympathetic to. And I'm also just highly averse generally to the Enlightenment notions that morality or human flourish can be scientifically engineered, that there can be a so-called science of morality, as Sam Harris would have us believe. But of course, his ideas are nothing new. They're just rehashed with French Enlightenment ideas with a pseudo-scientific gloss cribbed from, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies and the like. So I'm not at all impressed with that. And I used to be very deep in that sphere as well, by the way, the neo-atheist camp. And you can probably already understand the reasons I very quickly took my leave of it.
So what you're talking about reminds me of a recent show that I had, and I should do more. I think this was well received. It's called Afternoon at the Museum. And one of our friends in the chat here watching the show was with us. And I took a few of the ladies from the White Art Collective, and we visited some of the world's great museums. And then just casually went through the different paintings and pieces, etc. And, if something jumped out, we would enlarge it. I'd read a little bit about it and talk about it. And then through that experience, we were in many cases finding the meaning or creating the meaning of the paintings. Each one of us brought something slightly different to the interpretation of these beautiful classical works. Some of the works are not interpretive; they're just more aesthetically and historically important. Whereas other works, works specifically related to mythology, it left a lot of room there for personal interpretation. And I was actually quite moved by my friends' commentary and the way that they were able to uniquely go into each piece and pull something out of it that I didn't see. And so you talk about subjectivity, you talk about the primal element of our being, and that as it relates to art and beauty aesthetics. That's the real stuff. Like, that's getting right into it and experiencing it. So I'm really interested in connecting these two worlds. I feel that the world of art, it kind of, how do I say, it's sort of fuzzy around the edges. It's very hard for most people to define. There's some aspect of it that is subjective. There's another aspect that is not at all, that is very measurable through methods of critique. But I feel that the most of the world really comes from a kind of a scientific basis of, like, what is the utility of art? That kind of approach. And it has a utility, but that is the wrong tool to perceive the depth of it. Like, it's like a radio station with two channels. There's many channels. There's many wavelengths of meaning, and some of which can be quite profound. So I don't know. I'd like to maybe invite you on one of those shows. Would you like to come?
Oh, most definitely.
Cool. Well, let's get right into the meat of the show here. So I'd like you to talk to us about your impressions of Nullus's essay on Imperium Art. We ask all of our guests to do that, and it's a pretty intense essay as far as, you know, like it's very smartly written. It touches on some profound civilizational concepts that are, you know, very large. Nullus did a beautiful job. He's a true wordsmith. He crafts these ideas beautifully and has the background with which he can write with authority. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of hand it over to you, N of One, and see if you could maybe run down your notes and let us know what you thought of the essay.
Okay. So the most prominent theme from the essay, as far as I could tell, was art's role in fulfilling human spiritual need. That is to say, connecting us with the transcendent. I define spirituality as the yearning for a sense of belonging in the universe. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's just not the universe as defined by astronomers. It's not just a spatial universe. It can also be a temporal one. It can include our heritage, our connection to the past, and I think what Nullus described as our responsibility to our descendants. So we can be connected to the universe, both spatially and temporally, that way. And to me, religion is an attempt to organize via archetypes that speak to the very primal tendencies within us, a way of fulfilling the spiritual need. And art, of course, can play a highly significant role in that. And we witness this in how some of the most magnificent works of art ever produced have been toward religious ends. There's, of course, the Sistine Chapel ceiling. There's Notre Dame Cathedral. I'm thinking of all the wonderful Gothic architecture that we know medieval cathedrals by. There's something incredibly imposing and humbling about these works. Mm-hmm. It very effectively conveys that the world is obviously physically much bigger than our corporeal being. The more esoteric question about that arises from that is, does that mean that the world beyond you, your life, is of greater moral significance? And that comes down to, I think, your answer to that question as to how maybe literal versus metaphorically minded you are, because in one sense, you can't live any life but yours. In that way, it is completely atomized. And you simply can't know that anything beyond your phenomenological field is metaphysically real. You can believe it. You can try to will yourself to believe it. That's, I suppose, what faith is to a large degree. And there's a mystery there as to what the true relationship between the individual and the greater universe is. Mm-hmm. And that mystery is a significant part of religion. And the frisson that mystery evokes is something that art can convey. It can articulate that inarticulate sensation that way.
It's quite powerful stuff. There's so many ideas flying out of my head right now as I'm listening to you talk. I feel that, you know, European religious art specifically as a category, it certainly opens us up to and connects us to a metaphysical world, a spiritual world, a world beyond this physical plane. But at the same time, it's created by us. right? You walk into the Sistine Chapel or this kinds of, or you look at certain kinds of art, architecture, sculpture, etc. Music is a huge part of that. And it takes you to another world. You're now in another world. And it's just quite fascinating how that the mechanism of our minds and our spirits operate with art to take us away from or out of or beyond our physical kind of scientific measurable reality. So I think that comes back to what you were saying about spirituality is the yearning to belong to or to connect to the universe in some larger way beyond our mortality even. I don't know. I think Nullus might have a few things to add to that.
I would add the generational aspect of the example of the cathedral, where there's a civilizational calling, if you will, among the builders of that cathedral. You'll have one generation build the foundation, the next generation takes upon it to build the walls, then the roof, and so on and so forth. So there's a how should I say, a material representation of a metaphysical reality that they perceive, and so that is manifest through this cathedral. From a religious point of view, you would say that God is working through these individuals. They're continuing this same development, this continuity that we constantly talk about in the Imperium Art project, where we try to understand that we are more than just individuals. We're more than just people. We are, we have a place, we have a locus, we have a relationship to one another. We have a relationship to the metaphysical, to the divine, and all of these things are connected. So from my perspective, for example, I look at this as a synergist kind of relationship where everything, if you take one component out of this grouping, then ultimately it falls apart. And maybe I can address, because you mentioned romanticism in your introduction, and I was fairly critical in my essay of romanticism. But I do want to qualify that I am not critical of the goals of romanticism. I'm more critical of their conclusions. In other words, striving towards man becoming God is the danger that you might encounter when you sever that tie, when you say that man is always going to look for some form of religion, and if they don't find it, they'll look for it in themselves. And I think that's the danger that I mentioned. So the critique isn't really about the goals of romanticism. So I just wanted to point that out. But other than that, yes, everything. I guess we could continue with the next point. But if you have any comments to this, N1, I'd be very interested.
I remember in college studying Chartres Cathedral and discussing how the stained glass windows were aligned with both the rising and setting sun, and so that during Mass, people would see these windows illuminated and be reminded of the stories, these archetypes that they were illustrating in very organic and beautiful fashion through sunlight. And of course, the sun is a very significant element in the larger universe. And so that's an instance of how faith and art in very actually practical and clever fashion can marry synergistically, as you described. And it's by being reminded of the significant cosmic element of these stories that people can practice their faith, and art is of very great utility in that way. I just thought that was a particularly striking example of it.
So there's a thing I can comment on here. Art plays a role in different religions in the world, certainly in the East and West. And I call it a spiritual technology. So we visualize things, we see the saints and the Buddhas and the gods and the whatever it is that we're practicing. And through being able to visualize them, especially with iconography that has meaning, it, I don't know how to explain this, but it essentially lives in your mind and therefore in your heart and through your life. I can tell you from my practice of Buddhism that, especially Tibetan Buddhism, specifically Tibetan Buddhism, you have to memorize all the iconography of say, the hand gestures or the jewelry or the objects that they hold, and et cetera, et cetera. So as you memorize that, and then you visualize yourself as that being. And this is a practice of alchemy, where you're transforming yourself into that Buddha, and or I guess harnessing the spirit of that Buddha. And it's something that is completely alien to the West, but I think it's relevant to this discussion. I think that perhaps maybe in Christian art or other types of art, there's a very powerful and strong relationship that you have with, you know, the figure in the artwork, if it's the Virgin Mary or et cetera, et cetera. So art is essential for religion, as far as I can tell. So what I'm feeling is then, well, what is art? If art can do that in religion, how can it function for nationalism? How can it function for our identity and saving, you know, Western civilization from the current paradigm? That is a really central question to this project, to our movement, and I think it has to be brought up and it has to be like taken apart. Do you have any concepts on that?
Yeah. Just as religion is this motivational memeplex constructed of archetypes, we need to apply, like, this spiritual technology, you call it, of art to leverage those. And some of the most powerful and persuasive emotions to appeal to, certainly with archetypes, is fear. And there is a whole gamut of such archetypes to choose from. There is, of course, the snake, which was our, historical, enemy in the grand scheme of things. And there's a, very significant reason for dragon mythology and the presence of serpents and such as symbols in the Bible and elsewhere, Ouroboros. And I think also a very significant and perhaps potentially powerful archetype we could exploit would be that of the devouring mother, which happens to be an aspect of the goddess Parvati in the form of Kali. And one of the biggest problems, as Kurt Doolittle has put it, is that we have not figured out a way to effectively suppress antisocial feminine behavior, and perhaps overly effective at suppressing the antisocial masculine, but not the feminine. And it's this nurturing instinct with nowhere to go that has been the cause of so much misery of late. It's the blind reverence, the worship of this unchecked altruistic instinct. It's the reason we're letting all these refugees into our countries. And I think putting our own modern spin on that archetype of the devouring mother, and I don't think it's a coincidence either. I'm pretty sure that the Hindi term for the decline stage of civilization, Kali Yuga, shares its name with that aspect of the goddess Parvati, Kali, the devourer.
I understand. Yeah. This is powerful stuff. It's fascinating to me that Vedic information has kind of found its way into the white nationalist sphere in some sense. It's common to hear people talk about, surf the Kali Yuga. And, but that's a little bit of a side note here, though. What I'm taking from what you're saying is that, through art, to kind of answer the question I proposed earlier, through art, we can internalize heroic, godlike archetypes. And that, again, harkens back to the topic of identity. So I think that's the popularity of these kind of synthwave memes where you have ancient statues of Greek gods, Roman soldiers, etc., in some beautiful kind of modern Photoshop neon glow, all these types of filters that it's really effective. There's something about it. It's not just cool. It actually has an archetype in there, and it's that become who you are archetype, if you will. So I feel like, that's at least one answer that we could have. But my impulse is that I'm trying to encourage artists in our sphere and writers, musicians, everybody and anybody to dig deeper and pull this apart more intensely and go deeper into this topic. We have to create the so-called religious art of our movement, if you will. You see what I'm saying? Like, what is our cathedral? What is our stained glass? What is our Gregorian chants, for our movement? And so I suppose these questions can't be answered right now, but I feel that they're important. So Nullus, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a very polite and slight pushback to you, Donald, on the question of the Eucharist is a classic example of mystical transformation in the Christian context. So it does exist. I would not call it alchemy. I would call it a mystical transformation as opposed to a physical transformation, understanding of the blood, the wine, the body, the bread. These aren't physical manifestations, although it's understood as such. But what it really is a mystical transformation, and it's not alchemy. And this comes down to an interesting topic that I kind of contend with on occasion, which is the mystical versus the magical, the sorcerer versus the mystic, if you will. The concept of the sorcerer, the magic is someone who is an illusionist, someone who's conjuring up things to misdirect you, if you will. That's how I define the magic. Now, again, this is just my personal definition of it. Obviously, there are going to be 1,000,001 interpretations on this. And the mystical or the mystic is the person who is an expression of truth, an expression of our reality. And in the context that I'm thinking, of course, is that you're bringing in the metaphysical into that. And that's the mystical transformation that we need, that I believe, at least, that we need. But as far as the masculine question is concerned, I think this is a very important topic. And I think we've addressed this, I think, on previous episodes, or we've touched upon it. My biggest concern is that we are the altruism is a feminine trait. It is not a masculine trait. There's nothing wrong with altruism if it's balanced properly with the appropriate amount of masculinity. So you do need to bring in and incorporate your masculine side. And I think that N of One is absolutely correct in his description of how the masculine has been, well, I would say subverted, but you could also say that it was misdirected or misguided, if you will. But suffice it to say, we need to embrace our masculinity. We need to embrace a certain kind of unapologetic expression of who we are. We don't have to be the people who bend to whatever the current trends are, who we don't express ourselves to placate others. We express ourselves to express truth. And I think that's something that's a very masculine trait that we need to bring back. Yeah. And I think that would provide a necessary balance. So expressing it through our nationalism, expressing it through our respective identities, and bringing that out, and being that one man who stands in the crowd and says, enough. No, I do not accept this. I am right here, and I am not going to move. That's what we need. So N of One, I'll because I tend to run on tangents here. So I'm gonna stop before I'm gonna try to stop before I get ahead of myself here.
Well, let's get back to the essays then. N of One, if you want to just run down your notes on that.
Okay. Yeah, I like that you started with a T.S. Eliot quote. Very classy. That guy was the most reactionary artist to ever live. So I very much approve. And yeah, he uses the word supernatural. Secularists don't understand it. And you can spurg about what that really means. Like, if something exists, is it natural? Is the word supernatural superfluous? But I think you could just as easily substitute the word transcendent. I do like that word because clearly, I mean, much of what religion speaks to is that which transcends our own lifetime. Now, it still partially overlaps with our lifetime, right? Because we don't want to see our children distressed over their future, because our happiness correlates with theirs, very highly. And it's in that sense that we as individuals, our well-being is bound up with those both who came before and those who come after that way. But let's go on. I do have some notes. You criticize, Nullus, the modern preoccupation with world building, and essentially you say that what Tolkien has done, everyone is simply trying to shamelessly ape. Yes. And this comes at the detriment of character development and a stimulating story arc. And that can be true, that there can be a trade-off. But on the other hand, I think there is value in actually showing the significance of our surroundings. And in that way, teaching a lesson that much of our fate is actually beyond our control. And it's to us as individuals within this universe to focus on what we can control. Indeed, a very famous Austrian who had some political success got his start as an artist. And one feature that characterized his art was actually the subordination in the composition of his paintings of the individual people to the environment, and often in the landscape pieces that Uncle Adolf would do, they were almost insignificant compared to the great buildings or cathedrals or government offices he would depict, or the natural surroundings. So I do think that there is actual value in that. You also cite the example of Harry Potter, which is, of course, virulently anti-white.
Right.
Getting Red Pill absolutely ruined that franchise for me, I have to say. But my comment on that is really, how much does the weight of world building matter in the construction of literature? I don't think that elaborate world building or detailed backstory, lore building, you could call it, is necessarily a bad thing. It can stimulate the card collector in us, the world, the people who like the butterfly collector, or the cataloger that way. So it can actually, I think, build world building, enrich characters by better defining the context of the environments like they negotiate, and can actually in that way enrich the character. This was very much the approach Ayn Rand took in my favorite novel of hers, We the Living, which shows how conditions of dictatorship are absolutely suffocating to the most heroic among us. And that past a certain point, there is a certain existential futility. The environment is so oppressive that no flourishing is possible. And you could argue she takes it too far, because Rand herself was somewhat of an environmental determinist. She subscribed to the blank slate view of personality, which is incorrect. But there is a very powerful rhetorical significance in constructing worlds this way and depicting how they affect the characters. And let's see, you contrast this with traditional folk fables, etc. They contain themselves to one story and don't inject complex universes where trade negotiations are described in excruciating detail or explain the horticulture of some obscure flower. This is very true. The folk tales and fables are more bare bones constructions from archetypes, and the patina on them is that much more thin. It is very different from some of these more modern approaches that way. I've probably gone on long enough. Does anyone else care to comment on that?
Well, no, that was a very good critique of my commentary on world building, and I think that you make some excellent points that illustrate good examples of how world building can work. My greatest concern with world building is not the lore, or a good example where you mentioned, the individuals are insignificant in the grand scheme of the surroundings that they're in. In a sense, what you have in those cases is you can easily lose yourself, or the audience can lose themselves in the lore. You essentially identify with one aspect of the world building, and you lose the point of the entire story arc. And then you are, maybe I'll use the Warhammer 40K example, because I believe that that's a very popular example of world building, where you have an amalgamation of different societies, races, political structures, you name it. Everything is thrown into the kettle. And it's interesting, I'll admit it. There's some very fascinating stories within the world building of the Warhammer 40K lore. But if you do notice, each of them are individual stories within the grander scheme of the world build that they're building. So you're always relying on a story arc, on an individual in that story. So maybe the fear that I have, for example, is that somebody will identify with the orcs, stay with the orcs, and lose the point of what this whole story is about. And that's really my I would say my greatest critique with world building. I'm generally not against the idea of world building, but I think that we are better served when we have characters that we can identify with directly. And then whether that's in a grander scheme, or whether that's in a fable or a short story, we can then, that's a stylistic question in my opinion. But that's really where I would say my greatest critique with world building lies.
I see. There's a risk of a certain Stockholm syndrome,
right,
that the reader could experience if the author ensnares him with a web of excessive world building detail and kidnaps him, and they become lost in the world itself and forget about the actual story taking place within that world. It's certainly a valid.
It's sort of a danger that we see a lot in like the modern film industry. It's just all eye candy, and you 2 hours go by, and you feel like, what did I learn from that? It wasn't an art experience. Yeah. You
know what? A good example of that probably would be the Marvel movies and the more recent Star Wars movies.
Yeah.
Where you have grand special effects, really good, high quality special effects. You have excellent scenes. You have excellent world building in a sense. You can really imagine yourself in that world in a sense. But what they're doing while presenting you this world, they're also inoculating you with some kind of a message that you might not agree with otherwise. And it's in a way, one could argue that this is a very underhanded way of trying to condition you through the world building. So that would be another example of a critique against the world building if you focus only on the world building. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, you characterize Harry Potter as emphasizing world building over character development. But I think part of the reason Harry Potter is so successful is because it actually balances very well the relatability of the character, especially to adolescents. Harry and his friends' anxieties, trials and such, apart from all the actual sorcery, are actually very relatable. They're ones all the Muggles share. But the world is also very, very richly developed as well, and can be an end in itself for the reader. That way, there's lots to connect to for the reader with Harry Potter. It's very accessible in those respects.
In that sense, I would have to agree that it does balance it. Although when I look at the reaction of the audience and how they relate, in most cases, at least, if you look at the fandom surrounding Harry Potter, I don't see them identifying with the characters. I see them identifying with the world around it. And that, to me, is always something that would be a red flag when we're talking about critiquing world building.
Something on a little aside on that, since I'm researching and developing children's books now, I'm looking at, well, what are kids reading these days? And the question really is, what are people publishing these days? And who's publishing and what's their ulterior motive? So a lot of books on magic and black magic and witchery and these things are targeted towards girls now. So this comes back to the subversion of, you're enchanted by this amazing world building environment, if it's in a book or in a film, etc. And then, a message is kind of slipped in underneath there. We know who runs Hollywood. We know who owns Hollywood.
Donald, that would be the magic that I referred to earlier. Mm-hmm. The illusions that are being spun around a subversive message.
Mm-hmm. So it sort of enchants you. It's kind of like, and then you're in a sense brainwashed because you're open, you're kind of mentally, spiritually open for these messages, and then they get kind of sunk in there. So there's definitely a massive danger in that. And every single artist in the White Art Collective and in our sphere, and even non-artists in our sphere, have to be acutely aware of these things in media. We have to be very discriminative, I guess, if that's a word. We have to discriminate looking at artworks, TV, movies, etc. So let's move on, though, onto the next topic here. I'd like to let N of One continue with his discussion.
Okay. So you say that the timelessness of fables, folklore, etc., comes from the crucial element that these stories could happen anywhere with anyone. And this actually relates nicely to the last topic, because the question that provoked in me is there a trade-off between contemporary relevance or relatability and timelessness? And I think that perhaps today that trade-off is overstated, because there are such things as human universals that these archetypes speak to, especially to women, apparently. And women tend to be more religious than men. And so perhaps they are, for that reason, more manipulable, even with ostensibly secular material. And I also like going on. I highlighted you're giving T.E. Holm and Ezra Pound their due as contributors to the free verse genre. I like that you don't take a sweeping, or shall we say broad brush, I guess that would be an appropriate cliche, to modernism and postmodernism categorically. You acknowledge that there are valuable works that have come out of these movements and genres, and you could say that there are exceptions that prove the rule, but as to whether the rule is inherent to the movement or genre is, I think, a deeper question. Mm-hmm. So that leads us to your, elements specifically of Imperium Art. And the first objective, the first element you have here, repositioning the soul of the European man in Imperium Art. And in this section, you critique broadly the Renaissance in its anthropocentrism. Its emphasis on making man the master of the universe, which was also a criticism you had of Romanticism and Transcendentalism, capital T.
Mm-hmm.
And that is certainly valid. When people don't stop being formally religious, when they stop being formally religious, they don't stop being instinctively religious. There is this God-shaped hole that persists, and often this vacuum is filled in by all manner of absolutely horrid refuse. And there is a grave danger there. But there's also this apparent contradiction that seems to arise. You caution it against the notion of putting man at the center, but earlier you were talking about the danger in overly elaborate world building, which seems to marginalize the characters in a story. So how do you strike the appropriate balance between these principles, Nullus?
That's a very good question. First of all, just to address the religious question, I think that women are differently religious than men. I think women tend to be more altruistic, and men tend to be more aesthetic. So in other words, they look for more in terms of understanding their suffering and overcoming their suffering, as opposed to the women who are looking for ways to comfort other people. So I think the way I look at religion is different expressions of religion, as a masculine and as a feminine. Getting back to the question, so this is a difficult one, right? Because we look at ourselves as individuals, but we are also a part of a community. And so when we're forming this world around us, then we have to understand ourselves as the main character of our own story. I think that may be a simple way of explaining it to you. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I would say that it does. I pursue that reconciliation process in my own way on my channel. Indeed, my very screen name, I think, encapsulates this balance between the individual and the group. My name takes its sort of nerdy aspect from the term in science and statistics for in anecdotal experience, which is sometimes jokingly referred to as an N of 1. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, your individual identity is composed of multiple and many identities.
Yes.
And virtually all of these identities you share with at least some other people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the various balance, the particular weighting that your own value set assigns to these different identities that gives you your unique identity as an individual.
Right.
And as far as religion goes, I once asked Donald what he thought of cosmotheism, which is the religion that William Luther Pierce devised as what he believed could be a successor to Christianity, as a pan-European animating belief system. And that attempts to reconcile the transcendent and our yearning toward it with our own lives on Earth. And in terms of how we understand the world scientifically, it, in a nutshell, posits humanity as the universe becoming conscious of itself, and that the Aryan race is at the vanguard of this process. And that the language of God, metaphorically speaking, in terms of that concept, is genetics and mathematics. And it is through science that we, the most scientific and innovative of Earth's peoples, can effectively talk to God and connect with the transcendent that way.
I would just add maybe or respond to this by saying that, number one, I believe that, and this is my position on this, that Christianity is inherently European by nature. I don't think that it's necessary to reinvent the wheel. What I believe that we must do is defend that which our ancestors have painstakingly went through and debated and argued and developed and built over 2,000 years of European history. I think that by creating new, I'm not against generally creating new concepts, but when it comes to certain questions, I believe that we have to take this continuity into consideration, this understanding of where we came from in antiquity, how we understood ourselves, how that evolved through the centuries, how that was then recontextualized in history. And this is where I'm very critical of the later Renaissance, of humanism, of the Enlightenment, because they wanted to jump over that and go back to antiquity with disregard for the 1,000 years before them, where they were trying to figure it all out. And I think that would be a disservice to those ancestors who worked hard on it. But even from a theological point of view or a faith point of view, I think that it's something that we should either embrace. I believe that we should all embrace it. It's an overarching theme for all of us. It can be an overarching theme for all of us. And again, this is more that theological debate that we all have. But by understanding that we already have these traditions embedded into our traditions, we already have these traditions embedded into our faith, it's up to us to embrace it. It's up to us to then take a second look at it and say, wait a second, it is something that belongs to us. It's something that not only does it belong to us, but our ancestors fought, died, and struggled to maintain. So only until recently, has the concept of Christianity become, so to speak, extra European, maybe the last 300-400 years. And so, but if you look at the entirety of it, it is a European tradition. So it's something I believe we need to embrace personally. I think that looking at other alternative ideas on it, and this comes back to this multiple identity question that or aspect that the layered identity that you've mentioned earlier, that when we were looking at this as a symbiotic relationship, my personal individual identity of who I am, my name, let me just say my name, that's who I am. My last name is the tribe that I belong to. This is the family the Gens that I belong to. My ethnic identity is the tribe that I belong to. And you can then expand it to various different layers of identity, but they all flow together, and they all you're expressing all of these identities, in my opinion at least. You're expressing all of these identities at the same time, and how you're expressing it then, of course, defines who you are as the individual. So I don't know if that answers your question, and I didn't want to rant a little bit on this, but I hope I made sense.
I think so, definitely.
Well, let's try to.
Christianity is controversial, of course, because of its origin, but of course, to categorically dismiss it for that reason would be a patent genetic fallacy, and I don't do so. I'm not a Christian myself, or even religious at all. But Christianity it's very multifaceted. It's gone through many different iterations over its lifetime. And I suppose the question for us now is it a mortal lifetime?
Right.
Or has Western civilization moved on, or is outgrowing it? I'm not sure, but I suppose we better get on to some more items here. Mm-hmm. Let's see, within the first element, we talk about morality. Yes. Immorality, as well will always be with us. And the question is whether an artist, I think, empathizing with an immoral person so as to produce more convincing, with greater fidelity, art that represents this aspect of the human condition is himself moral or immoral to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a judgment call, but I certainly appreciate art such as film noir or industrial music as a genre that that expresses the fallen aspect of man, and I don't think it's something that should be swept under the rug for puritanical reasons, no matter how nobly motivated.
Yes, yeah, and that's a difficult question always when you look at the lifestyle or the background of the, and I don't mean their ethnic or racial background, but I mean more their lifestyle, their socialization. When you look at various artists who've created immeasurably beautiful works of art, how do we judge that? And again, some arguments say that the divine flows through the person in spite of himself. And one could argue that the what we would call the biospirit of the European condition flows through that individual. And so whether they are individually immoral, the morality of the whole still flows through them, or that absolute morality that they socialized in growing up.
So speaking of these things, the second one of the elements is contextualizing ethnos, mythos, and logos in Imperium Art. Did you have any responses to that? End of one?
Yeah, a dual framework of mythos and logos was one with which we approached great books of Western civilization in a college course I once took. And the way I differentiate between the two and define them is to say mythos is a vertical communicative mechanism. It's that which is handed down from the elder to the younger, from generation often to generation. And it's packaged often, as we've discussed, in archetypal terms. It's not meant to be taken literally. These are things like fables and folklore, whose lessons are almost universally applicable, both across time and geography. Whereas logos, and unfortunately that word has suffered a great deal of abuse, even within our own circles, as just this pretentious cliche that people bandy about to effectively refer to Aryan will to truth. That's really how it's used, but academically it has a much more specific meaning. It's of course where the logy suffix derives from, and what it is a horizontal transmission, or you could also say dialectical communicative mechanism. It's giving one's account. Indeed, it actually can just mean word, but of course word can be metaphorically applied to mean account or story, like I give you my word, of the world as one currently sees it. Not necessarily the distillation of it over the generations. It's peer-to-peer, man-to-man. And this is, for one thing, how the scientific method operates. It starts with one account, or what we call hypothesis, engineered to be falsifiable, that is, subject to dialectical critique. And it's a different approach to better understanding the world. But of course, our consciousness is composed of different layers of understanding. There is the primal and the instinctual, which the archetypes of mythos tend to speak to more directly. And then there's the more advanced components of our brain that are deliberative, and that logos, dialectical critique, argument, and even logic, which is not, uncoincidentally related, speak to.
Amazing analysis of all that. I think what I particularly respond to is how you talk about sort of the different layers of our mind, and how there's a side to it that responds to myth and something more esoteric, as opposed to the more logical side of our brain. And I feel like, as kind of complex as this is, it's so essential and so basic, and something that every artist has to use while they're making art. If I'm composing a song, I have to know all the math of the notes and the scales and how they interact, the technique, etc., versus how do I emote this intense feeling of whatever it is, existential angst or whatever. Or if I want to write about a topic in history or make a painting, etc. It's the merging of these two minds, if you will.
Yeah, in poetry, you have the same thing. You'll have the structure of the poem, the logic of the poem, versus the way what you're trying to express in the poem that you're writing. So there's a fine art in how you're contextualizing the mythos, the story that you're trying to present, with the logos of the structure of the poem itself. And I think that's actually, N of One, that was a very, very brilliant summation of what it is that hopefully I was trying to convey in that section.
So number 3, the collaboration of the continuum through the Imperium. We've kind of talked about that already. It's a simple concept, but N of One, did you want to make any comments on that before we move on?
Let's see, collaboration.
Number 3 comments.
I don't believe so. I think, let's see, you talked about the movement.
The point I'm making would be more or less about connecting our history with now into the future.
Yeah, all I have to say about that is that's pretty easy to do, because our struggle is so obviously pan-European, and the agenda actually is, the eradication of our race as it stands as an obstacle to world government. So those are very dramatic stakes. It's pretty obvious where we stand in the grand course of history. So I don't have much more to say about that. Certainly.
So number 4, the cognitive dominance of the cultural insurgency. I think maybe Nullus should expand on what he calls cognitive dominance quickly.
Well, before we get into that, I try to explain to people that this is not a black pill approach. So I'm not blackpilling everyone when I say that we lost the culture war. What I'm trying to say is that we've lost the culture war, and we must understand how we must properly strategize and approach ourselves in this culture insurgency that we're in, because that's exactly what it is. This is a revolt against the imposition of the inversion of who we are. And so I think that when we're talking about it, this isn't a black pill. This is just a realization and an objective, in my view, at least an objective truth. So when you're in that situation, you need to have your wits about you. You need to, and then that's where I drew from this is an official term, cognitive dominance. It's used in the medical field. It's for surgeons, for example, but it's also used in military context as well. Having your wits about you when everything around you is chaotic. And I think that that's an important component of how we as artists must act. So we have to balance, we have to embrace the full emotional spectrum, but we have to make sure that we're in control of our emotions and not that our emotions are in control of us.
Yes, and I think contemplative discipline is a very effective means to that. I myself practice meditation. That's about as spiritual I get. I do like the sense of intimacy with my environment that it provides, but it also helps sharpen my own thinking because my brain is so naturally overactive. Just giving it a chance to rest is a very refreshing reprieve. And I think that is something that can facilitate cognitive dominance as well, because as they say, courage is a muscle. It's not enough to tell yourself that, oh, I'm just going to maintain perfect sang-froid in these life or death scenarios and just think that's good enough. It's something that you have to practice on a continual basis. And that takes actual discipline. The brain is an organ, as like many others, and it needs to be trained. And this notion of cognitive dominance, I very much like, especially as a Randian. She would absolutely endorse that wholeheartedly, I would say, because emotions are awesome because they are the most important defining features of our identity. Really, they're where we get our morality from. Our will to live is not something that's rationally excogitated, but it's an absolute disaster if we try to think with them. And because it's simply different. Part of knowing yourself is differentiating between your emotions, your values, and the most logical course of action in realizing those values. It's the reason we call it actualization. And to do that, of course, requires great mental discipline.
Exactly. Yep.
I think your point on meditation is extremely key and something that our sphere is woefully inexperienced with. People seem to associate it with some hoo-ha new ageism or something or other, and don't understand the actually very natural aspect of what it is and how it contributes to one's overall health in general, and how we actually meditate in everyday experiences in certain types of activities we do. But this specific use of meditation for the development of courage, this is a very beautiful and profound concept, and very central, not just for the artist, for the sort of warrior poet, if you will, but for everybody else. And in a sense, I would say this could be a theme of art, and maybe something I'd like to explore more, this sense of like overcoming your fears. When I do martial arts, I spar to a level where I try to trigger the fight or flight instinct in my lower brain, that kind of reptilian mind where whereas I can really feel fear, and then within that fear be calm and trigger that meditative state that I've rehearsed so many times. So that way, when I'm in a flurry of punches and kicks, time almost stops. It slows down, and I calmly address every single one of them. So that's just an analogy for our movement. If every single one of us is working on developing our capacity to overcome fear in many ways, I think dialectic helps a lot. That's like a basic tool, the weapon of language. But just the sense of calmness, when you have to like respond and defend everything everybody says, you're not showing strength, you're showing weakness. You should allow, if the other person's wrong and they're trying to change you to make you follow their way, and you don't even offer an explanation, they sense your power. They realize this person is way beyond me, and that comes through calmness. And so that comes through. And so this is the first time on this show we've really unraveled this concept of cognitive dominance, and it's really quite awesome.
This is a part of the conversation where I said that we need to focus a little bit more on the spirit aspect of the biospirit. This is one element of that.
I would agree. So let's move on. Number 5, the dialectics of artistic violence. Let's let N of 1 respond to that first.
Well, yeah, it's the perfect topic to address at this point. Donald, you were describing your experience practicing the martial arts, and you, Nullus, cite Marinetti's Manifesto of Futurism as providing a roadmap toward the training regimen, you could call it, of the warrior poet, which is a term that entered my mind actually right at the very moment Donald uttered it. So very much aligned in this discussion on this topic, certainly. And I think that it's a perfect metaphor because poetry does tend to connote peace. It's something that we do in a state of repose. So perhaps the juxtaposition with the word warrior is somewhat counterintuitive. But of course, an effective warrior is a man who's at peace with himself, who knows himself, who knows what he's fighting for, what his strengths and weaknesses are, and develops a strategy and applies tactics within that strategy to leverage those strengths and minimize the weaknesses. And so I think that is actually like the perfect metaphor to capture this new approach for all of us in training ourselves and preparing ourselves for this great struggle we are all involved with.
Beautifully said. So there's a lot here to unpack. I think that the word violence alone triggers a lot of people, but we're talking about artistic violence. And a lot of people have had some difficulty kind of unwrapping that. Maybe Nullus could just give us a brief definition of artistic violence.
Artistic violence is unapologetically embracing the full emotional spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is allowing yourself to be who you are. Yeah. It is allowing yourself to stand out there and express violence in a way that is balanced. It's not, mm-hmm. It's not a gratuitous violence. It's not violence for violence's sake. It's not a bloodlust.
Mm-hmm.
What this is expressing rage. It's expressing anger, frustration. And what I feel many times is that we try to avoid these aspects of our emotion for the greater good, as it were, and that kind of ties into the altruism aspect, the feminine aspect.
Yeah,
the masculine embraces these emotions, but also tempers it, and that's an important aspect. And that's where I use the Song of Roland as kind of a tempering mechanism to say, wait a second, hold your bloodlust, hold your rage, and understand what it is that you're fighting for. Understand who the brother is standing next to you, fighting alongside you. Understand what your purpose is, and then engage. Because without understanding any of this, we then run into doing things that are actually very counterproductive to our goals.
I'd say since the 1960s, we've grown up in a culture of, quote, peace and love. And what that's done, in a sense, is sort of emasculated the culture. It's made us into this feminized, pathologically altruistic culture where, guns should be taken away and all that. And any expression of self-determination, and I mean, I'll put it this way, the most cruel side of the left and its culture against the right is how they silence us, they terrorize us from expressing our anger. That we're as if we don't have a valid reason to be angry, even though we're being replaced and genocided. I mean, imagine killing someone and telling them, "Oh, don't cry and don't scream." Like, it's sick as hell. It's just dementedly sick, and that's what they're doing to us on a systemic level, on a global level. So if I post some fash wave memes or something or other, that's a red flag. Watch out for that guy. Put him on a list. And it's sickening to me how they celebrate their anger and violence against us. They're openly they own the platforms, they own the social media, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a news bit about a week or so ago about a woman at Yale University saying she fantasizes about shooting white people in the head, and no, she had no consequences, and she got paid to give that speech at Yale, and so. Meanwhile, we have to use words like Uncle A, like we can't express our anger and violence, yet we're absolutely justified in feeling this. If we don't have some transmutation of that anger into something productive, healthy, logical, meaningful, and in some form of activism, politics, culture, what have you, then I do fear that it could turn into something ugly. And I think everybody knows that, but nobody talks about it. The arts are a way to express that. The arts are a way to take that anger, that justified anger of white genocide, and put it into something cultural with which a sort of, fire we can dance around. It's something that we can rally around, and that obviously reaches out to other whites, and it demonstrates to the enemy, we will not go down without a fight. We will not die away. We will not shut up. We're going to express our anger in a balanced way. Because here you're saying, that the dialectics of artistic violence. We're not just saying violence, So
Exactly.
check out dialectics of artistic before you look at violence.
And so, just quickly, I want to read a very short translation. I'm working on an epic poem by a Hungarian poet called Jenő. His name is Jenő Gida, and just a few lines I'd like to read, because I believe that this expresses artistic violence right here. These 4 lines, and this is from a poem called Psalmus Hungaricus, and the poet's name is Jenő Gida, and so this is my translation of that passage. What do I care about history, of how it once had been? Can you be a sage or a poet when you hear your mother scream? That's artistic violence.
The reverberations that comes off that are very stultifying. They halt you in your tracks. Very powerful stuff. Did you want to conclude anything on that topic right there, N of 1, or should we move on?
Yeah, those lines were too hard to follow. Let's move on.
Okay.
So for element 6, I highlighted the phrase realistic virtues that renounce the self-immolation of pathological moralizing. And I thought this was an absolutely beautiful piece of diction from you, Nullus.
Thank you.
And I found myself just saying amen, brother, to that when I read it, because I absolutely can't stand moralizing. And I think it bespeaks character weakness, because the fact of moral conflict arises from intractable differences in our identities. And people who have this overriding compulsion to forcibly mold others, either like physically or dialectically, according to their own identity, that is to say, they can't tolerate others being different from them in even a very fundamental way, or one that puts them in mortal conflict with the other. They would rather just destroy everyone who isn't them, because they're like these schoolyard bullies who simply pick on other people because these bullies are uncomfortable with the fact of their peers' differences from them. They're afraid of difference. But of course, it's differentiation that to a great degree defines life itself. So to reject the fact of intractable individual and cultural differences, even on the existential level that morality pertains to, bespeaks a terrible spiritual brittleness, in my humble opinion.
Well said. I can't even add anything to that because I agree with that fully.
Beautifully done. Beautifully done. Transcendence of idealism of the Imperium. Fascinating. This, by the way, I urge people who are watching this show to go to Nullus's site and download the essay itself. Read it yourself. We're only, we're covering what we can, but the essay is quite powerful and quite rich. There's a lot of content here. So what I'm going to do is leave that link below the show notes, and certainly, we invite people to engage with us and engage in this discussion. So, and you can do that online. You can contact us. But I feel that it's an important thing for us to continue to talk about. This essay specifically, it's kind of the centerpiece, honestly, of the Imperium Art project. So there's that.
I just wanted to add one thing, and I wanted to thank N of One for his detailed analysis of the essay. And you mentioned a lot of very valuable points that have made me also think about certain things that I've written in the essay. So I highly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for sharing the work with me. I very much enjoyed reading it. It was quite thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Do you have any closing thoughts then, N of One?
Yeah. So we started off the discussion with how I was red-pilled, my introduction to all this, and I mentioned Ayn Rand, and then again later in the middle. And so I thought it would be fitting to conclude with a thought, and that is just how Ayn Rand marketed her philosophy, which she described as viewing man as a heroic being. And I don't think it's much of a stretch at all to simply substitute for man the Aryan as a heroic being. Mm-hmm. And a black pill earlier we were discussing was how the right has lost the culture wars. And to a degree, this is a function of the right generally being just lower in aesthetic openness, a little bit more sluggish and conventional in some ways, less instinctively revolutionary or radical than the left. The white pill, though, is that all revolutions are fought and won by a vanguard. And there is very much a difference within the right between the deep right, us, the vanguard, and the more shallow right. It is we who will lead them. And I know for a fact that given the depth of our talent pool, there are many heroes among us. So I just look to the artists among our people to inspire them and just to produce great, awe-inspiring works of art that channel the sublime and the divine, not just to motivate our people, not just as agitprop, but as ends in themselves, regardless of the particular outcome of our struggle. And that is something that I certainly commend you for, Donald, and and you as well, Nullus, for furthering that.
Thank you.
We serve this community, and of course, we're artists in the White Art Collective. So this dovetails perfectly into announcing again that this Saturday, 7:30, on the White Art Collective DLive, YouTube, and Odyssey channels, we will be debuting the first half of the first White Art Collective Music Festival. So this is a very, very major cultural event in our sphere. We're going to try to do this every year. I was very, very fortunate to be able to perform my songs with a band at this event. And so there's a lot of marketing going on. There's different channels talking about it. It's huge. It is the event right now. So please do visit us at the White Art Collective YouTube Odyssey DLive this Saturday, the 26th at 7:30 Eastern Time. And once again, N of One, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your insights. It's really been a fantastic pleasure talking to you tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The feeling is mutual. and it will continue when I tune in to that festival. I'm super stoked for that.
Excellent.
So I encourage all my viewers who are tuning into this to tune into that as well.
Brilliant, brilliant. And thanks also to Nullus once again for excellent commentary.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. So everybody in the chat, thanks so much for joining us. We love you very much. You guys are the elite of the Imperium Art project. Thank you so much for your encouragement, following, your commentary. We love you and we welcome you. So we will see you all next time. Have a wonderful evening.